Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers. Season 4, Episode 2, The One with the Messianic Jew. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. So I'm here with Rabbi Binyamin Sheldrake from the Adat Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Norwich. Welcome to the RE Podcast, Rabbi.
Thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
First of all, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are?
So I'm not only the rabbi of Adat Yeshua Messianic Synagogue here in Norwich, I also am currently the president of the UBMS, the Union of British Messianic Synagogues. I do a lot of conference work and under normal circumstances travel fairly extensively internationally as well, working with other conferences across Europe and also around the world. So I have a very varied and interesting job, working with people day in, day out, but also with a lot of development work, the vision work and so on of our union as it grows and develops, and welcoming in new people, things like that. So that's really what I do. I've been doing it now for 30 years in one form or another. Messianic Judaism here in the UK is relatively recent, so it's about 30 odd years old. We were one of the earlier congregations to start in Norwich 30 years ago. Others have come and gone, but we, for one reason or another, have survived the test of time, and we're still here 30 years on and growing and in our new building. And we bought this now 3 years ago because our numbers were getting to a level that we had to expand and grow and get our own place. So so we ran about 30 years in one form or another. So, part of the territory here in the UK.
Amazing. And just before we carry on, I want to ask you a little bit more about numbers, but what actually is a Messianic Jew?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it, really? If I had a short answer to that, then we could end the interview in a couple of minutes. The quick answer to it, I suppose people would say to you, a Messianic Jew is a Jewish person who believes in Yeshua. I'm not really ever happy with that as a simple answer. And the reason for that is because that would mean that there, for instance, are many Jewish people who are worshipping in churches, going to church on a Sunday, keeping Christmas and Easter, not keeping kosher anymore, and the rest of it. And they would then say that they are a Messianic Jew. I find that quite confusing in so many, many ways, because actually from the Jewish community side as well, they kind of balk at that idea, because obviously from the Jewish angle, they look at such a person and say, you're a Christian. Everything about you is a Christian. There is nothing about you that is Jewish. So apart from the fact of the DNA, effectively, there is nothing else Jewish about you. And it gets quite complicated when you then get into the whole identity argument of the DNA versus practice, religion, and so on. That gets into a very grey area very, very quickly. For me, the definition of a Messianic Jew, therefore, has to be something more than that. It's got to be someone who embraces their Jewish identity as well as their faith in Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah. Those two somehow have to come together in a real, authentic, practical way, in the sense of a Jewish person worshipping in a synagogue on a Saturday morning, on Shabbat, keeping the Jewish high holy days, not keeping the Christian high holy days, for instance. Someone who in some form or other is keeping the Shabbat holy, and also as regards, say, kosher laws and things like that too. So it's got to connect with what it actually means to be a Jew, more than just, I was born one. Because actually you can be born a Jew and you can be the strongest atheist in the world, and those people do exist too. And at which point do you then say, are you still a Jew then? If you're a Jewish person who doesn't even believe in God, for me, that is deeply axiomatic to what it means to be a Jew. If you don't believe in God, then who called you out of Egypt? Who established you as a nation? Who called Abraham? If you don't believe that this God exists, it's very difficult to say that you're a Jew, in my mind. So for me, the Messianic Jew has to be that. It's got to be someone who clearly is living out their Jewish identity. And the flip side of that, of course, is one final thought. Judaism does conversion. Always has done. The very famous converts all the way through. Ruth the Moabitess is the best one that everyone remembers, but there are many others in Scripture too. Judaism has always done conversions, and therefore it's not just about being born Jewish. It's not just about the DNA. Judaism is littered with converts all the way through history. No one has such a pure Jewish line except maybe the Cohens, the priests, really, really focus on keeping that line pure. So on that level, it's either born Jewish, practicing Jewish, a Jewish faith, and those who convert. and come and join us. And that's why Messianic Judaism, in our branch, in our union, we do conversions for those who want it, who go through our conversion course. So it's always a mixture of those born converts, but the real focus is a belief in Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah and the obvious Jewish lifestyle. Even wearing kippot, for instance, would be one aspect of that.
And actually, before we talk about Yeshua and what you understand by that, let's talk about your background, because actually you are a convert. You were not born Jewish. You were born into a non-religious family.
That's right. I mean, my own background is interesting and varied in many ways. So, I mean, according to the family tree, it is quite likely that there is some Jewish background, but I have to be honest, it's more than just a couple of generations ago. And that's why I never really stood on that as part of my identity per se. I wanted to make it very clear to people that even though there is likely to be that in the family, I wanted to make it clear that I was going through conversion as well to make the statement that this is a legitimate thing. And obviously, my own parents didn't bring me up as Jewish in that way. My own parents are atheists. And for me, it was an experience of reaching out to God in my teenage years that led to that breakthrough personally for me. And it's interesting, having spoken to you already, you know, it was not an obvious, necessarily Christian experience at that point, because that wasn't how I was brought up. That was not part of who I was as my identity. For me, I knew that I was walking with the one true God. And it was very clear that that sense of his presence was very powerful at that moment when I was 17. But I didn't really box it as such. I didn't classify it in the traditional kind of way, really. So for me, I walked on with God, and it did involve going to church for a few years because that seemed the starting place. But I very quickly kept digging and kept researching and kept trying to understand. And very quickly, in fact, then I came into Messianic Judaism, or shall we say, was one of the founding people in the UK to establish Messianic Judaism here. So yes, that's my own background, and I've been living a Jewish life now for over 30 years. So it is absolutely part of my identity, character. It's absolutely part of who I am now.
Fabulous. And I want to talk about Yeshua, but just roughly how many Messianic Jews are there in the UK or around the world?
Well, again, it's going to come down to your definition again, isn't it, really? But if you're talking about the broadest brush strokes, which would include everyone who would maybe self-identify in that way, although not maybe how we would understand it, you're probably talking in the many hundreds, I would think, across the UK, maybe even low thousands. It's not huge, but then the Jewish community is not huge in the UK. It's a very, very small percentage, even according to the latest census standards, less than 1% or something. It's very, very small amount of the Jewish people in the UK. So you'd kind of expect that to be reflected in the Messianic Jewish movement too. But that being said, it is growing enormously and has done so hugely actually through lockdown, with people, I think, asking more existential spiritual questions, having had the time to do so during lockdown. We've certainly doubled our numbers in the last year or so. We're up around about 50 plus now in membership or coming into membership in our synagogue here. And across the UK, we've got 3 or 4 congregations, slightly lower in numbers, or the one in London is probably about the same. Across the world, tens of thousands. I really wouldn't even want to put a number on it. In Israel, obviously, many, many. In America, obviously, huge number of people there as well. But in India, we have, for instance, 40 congregations in India affiliated to our international union, UMS as well, affiliated to us. And of course, each of those congregations have large numbers too. So pick your number. I really wouldn't want to put a firm number on it. All I would say is it is growing. And I think the influence is growing as well. The profile is certainly much higher now than it ever was. And that is causing a lot of people, both Christian and Jewish background, to reconsider their faith. Take another look at the scriptures and understand who Yeshua is, understand the history behind it, which I know we'll talk about a little bit as well. All of that is becoming a lot more intense now than it's ever been before. And that is excellent. That is very, very encouraging, because we do need to go back and have another look at all of these issues, which for many people have been brushed under the carpet, but actually we need to dust them down, take them out the closet again, and have another thorough look, because the narratives that we have been sold as history, both Jewish and Christian, are simply not true. They're not adequate to the historical record. But most people are afraid to go there and open those cases, and that is a shame. So are robbing themselves of some real deep understanding of the background of both Rabbinic Judaism, Messianic Judaism, and latter Roman Catholicism and Christianity later on down the road.
Well, let's start this foundation then of Yeshua. Who is Yeshua? Why is the name Yeshua significant? And why do you believe that Yeshua was the Messiah?
Well, three major questions.
Yes.
Okay, so who is Yeshua? Let's start with his name, because that's a slightly easier one than to jump straight in at. Why do we say Yeshua and not Jesus? First of all, because Jesus isn't his name. Jesus is, of course, the English transliteration of the Greek transliteration of the original Hebrew. The problem with the name of Jesus is it doesn't mean anything. It has literally no English meaning whatsoever. And the other flip side of that problem is for Jewish people, the name of Jesus means something of hatred, persecution, the Inquisition, the pogroms, and the Holocaust. Someone once said to me that the cross is merely a sword turned upside down. And that's the Jewish view, but in a nutshell. And honestly, it's not a bad view. That is exactly what Christianity has done to Judaism, to Jewish people for 2,000 years. It's spearheaded the persecutions, the hatreds, the murders and the slaughters, the crusades, and the list goes on and on and on, unfortunately. Christianity bred replacement theology, and replacement theology, again, in brief, is basically that the church has replaced Israel as the chosen people of God. And I would challenge anyone, and I mean anyone, from a scriptural point of view, from the raw data of biblical text, to prove that that is in any way, shape or true. It is simply not. It is a theology which is developed by the Catholic Church in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries to prove the fact of supremacy, superiority over the Jewish people as a defeated nation. And honestly, the church has been suffering under this ever since. It has forced theology into places it should simply never have gone and created a hatred towards the Jewish people that should never have existed. Give you one practical outcome of this, which is, I think, quite interesting. All the way through Christian history, there's been outreach to literally every nation under the sun, including Bible translations in every language which the Christians came across. It was only in the 1800s that the first ever translation into Hebrew of the New Testament happened. The 1800s, 1,800 years later, before someone thought, maybe, just maybe, actually the Jewish people need to hear about this. That shows you how deep that rabbit hole goes. Effectively, almost the last nation on earth that anyone thought needed to hear the good news, because for Christian thinking, the Jewish people were a cursed people, abandoned by God because of this fake theology of the Jewish people killed Messiah, which is not true. Jewish people clearly did not put Yeshua to death. It was the Romans that put Yeshua to death. And in fact, if anything, the scriptural record can be taken at face value, which I believe it can be. Yeshua actually said, I surrender my life as the sacrifice. He gave his life up. So no one took it, if you want to be blunt about the issue. And to blame the Jewish people for this act is simply crazy. It's just historically untrue, but it's created so much enmity and hatred there. So that's why the name of Yeshua is important, because it really places him as a Jew in history.
Yeah.
That Yeshua was a Jewish man, born in Israel, Bethlehem, in Bethlehem, born as a Jew, lived as a Jew, died as a Jew, rose again as a Jew. At no point did he ever become a Christian in his life. At no point did he ever teach another faith or religion. Again, challenge is an open one that I made just last week to anyone. Show me anything from the scriptures where Yeshua says, and I am now teaching a new religion called Christianity. It's simply not there. All of that was historical, post the 1st century and beyond into the Roman Catholic Church. That is not in the Bible. So we have to place Yeshua back as the Jewish Messiah that he is. And of course, it's been very convenient in many ways for Jewish people, because if Yeshua, this Jesus, is the Christian Messiah, he means nothing to Israel. He means nothing to the Jewish people, and Jewish people can safely ignore him. And this has been the problem from the Jewish side over the 2,000 years. He's not for us. And ignore. And actually, Yeshua is absolutely, totally for us as Jewish people, because he is the Jewish Messiah. And although this may upset a few people, not the Christian Messiah. He never claimed to be a Christian Messiah. The very concept of a Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, came from Jewish thinking. The church didn't invent this, it took the Jewish idea. And the whole origins of this is absolutely vital, therefore, to re-embed Yeshua back into that first century context of who he was. He was the fulfillment of prophecy. Comes on to your other issue there as well. For instance, Isaiah 53, which is obviously the classic one, we're getting into depth on it, but Isaiah 53, amongst many, many others, used to be understood in Jewish thinking as pointing to the Mashiach, the Messiah. It was only much later on, around the time of Rashi, for instance, one of our greats in Judaism, who then said, actually, we're going to stop saying this is talking about the Messiah and say it's talking about Israel. And the reason why is because Rashi and the many others in the medieval period there really got fed up with debating this with the church in this way and moved the interpretation over to something else. But all the ancient interpretations of these biblical prophecies are all pointing towards the Messiah, the ancient understandings of it. So there's nothing new particularly about this, and Yeshua did fulfill them all. And I think my final thought on this, if I can have one, is really this, is that you say, why is he the Jewish Messiah? One of the things that the Mashiach has to do is to be able to prove his descent from the line of David. And that is right now impossible. And it's impossible because the scrolls of the genealogical descents used to be kept in the temple. And they were all burnt and destroyed in 70 CE. And so actually today, it is literally impossible. If Mashiach were to appear today, as in like a new Messiah were to appear today, he would have to be able to prove, and I say it would be a he, by the way, he would have to be able to prove that he was descendant from King David. And you would not be able to do that today. It's one of the reasons why the Messianic writings, or as other people would call them, the New Testament, we call them the Messianic writings because there's nothing new about them, and it's not a testament. So Messianic writings is why they begin with the genealogical tables in Matthew and Luke to make it clear. It's one of the hinge proofs, in other words, of saying, and there's our descent, showing that he is born of the line of David. So that is one of the reasons why, proof-wise, we could go on, but it's one of the key issues which back up his claim in that way to being the Mashiach, to be the Messiah. And he's Jewish, and he's never been anything other than Jewish. Of course, any Messiah who claimed to start up a new religion wouldn't be a Jew anymore, and he would be classed as a heretic, and he most definitely wouldn't be the Messiah. So he cannot have created a new religion, otherwise it actually invalidates who he is.
So he fulfills the prophecies in Isaiah. I think, was there one in Daniel about the Messiah being born in the first century?
That's right, absolutely correct, Daniel 7 and elsewhere. And again, all the rabbis have said consistently through the ages, all the rabbis have said Messiah should have been born in the first century, but we missed him or we didn't know who he was. And then they shut down the discussion because it gets too controversial. Because, of course, there was one born in the first century and rabbinic Jews don't want him to be the one. So it all gets rather controversial and the whole debate gets shut down. But yes, according to the mathematical calculations based upon the book of Daniel, Messiah must have been born in the first century. And, of course, as a Messianic Jew, I would agree.
Yeah. And then obviously the prophecies in Isaiah 53 about the way he was going to be treated by others and the way that he died. And then obviously the genealogy linking back to King David. So you're convinced that Yeshua was the Messiah. Talk about the name Yeshua, because actually it has significant, you mentioned it earlier, that there's a meaning of that word that doesn't translate into the anglicized version.
That's right. Well, Yeshua in Hebrew means salvation. And this is why it is crucial that we use his real name of Yeshua. Yeshua actually is an abbreviation of the Hebrew name Yehoshua, God saves, and it's abbreviated down in this diminutive form to Yeshua. It's critical that we do this because it means something. When people go into any synagogue in the world, you will hear in the liturgy, in the prayers, the name of Yeshua running all the way through, because that word salvation is part of our prayer structure and our liturgical prayers. And it's quite a surprise when people realize this, because they don't realize the name of Yeshua is used regularly in non-Messianic synagogues too. This is why it's critical to really focus upon that name of Yeshua. The scriptures say God has become my salvation. It says, well, two things. He is our salvation and he has become my salvation. And it's a mixture of these two taken from the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that one of the key elements that Christians don't understand, they're used to saying God is love. They're not used to saying God is salvation. And really the two need to go hand in hand because it's God's love that brings that salvation. And the two really go hand in hand because God is our salvation. It's the part of the core character or personality of who God is. I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, time of the Exodus. He removes us from situations that are distressing, harmful, painful, and ultimately destroying us. He is our deliverer. And this concept of him being our salvation is deeply rooted in Jewish thought. He has become our salvation. Although he always has been our salvation, he becomes it when Yeshua is revealed to be the vehicle by which that salvation ultimately is expressed. So he is and he becomes. And this is really a core thought in Jewish thinking. And this is why we have to talk about Yeshua and not Jesus, because for Jewish people, hearing his name immediately embeds it within that conceptual field of Jewish thinking. And they therefore understand who Yeshua is. His whole life and his mission was centered on salvation and to bring that deliverance. Now, salvation in Jewish thinking works on two levels. There's the physical side of deliverance, as in bringing us up out of Egypt, removing alcohol from alcoholics, drugs from drug addicts. That, in a sense, you can see as the physical side of deliverance. And of course, as Jews, we're always involved with that, dealing with the homeless. We have our own food bank in the back of the synagogue and so on. That is the physical aspect of salvation. The spiritual aspect of salvation is just as important, which is, in the Jewish thinking, the way that sin has corrupted mankind and the way that we deal with each other, the selfishness, the egoism, the violence, the hatred, all of that essentially is just a mask that sin wears, but that's what's underneath it all, really. And sin is that rebellion against God. It masks itself up in all kinds of ways, but ultimately it says, I rule my life. That, from a spiritual angle, is a rebellious attitude towards God. It's called sin, and it causes a lot of the human problems that we have. And it's that issue, in a sense, if you say that God wants to release us from situations which are harming us, that includes ourselves, because we harm ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not just the physical self-harm, it's the emotional, psychological, relational, in every area. We harm ourselves because of sin. Whether it's greed, whether it's selfishness, you name it, we harm ourselves. And it's that also that God needs to save ourselves from. Lord, please save me from myself.
Yeah. I mean, just listening to you, I think one question I do need to ask is the idea of Trinity. So how does Messianic Judaism understand the Trinity? Is it distinct from the Christian idea? Is it distinct from the Jewish idea of God?
In the Injil Sharif, Hazrat Isa al-Masih taught, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see Allah." Many religious people are obsessed with outward purity, but Allah Ta'ala is concerned about the purity of our hearts. According to this ayat, we can only draw close to the Almighty if our hearts are pure. Come learn how Allah Ta'ala wants to purify your heart on the Injil from Lessons podcast.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's another one we could spend days discussing, isn't it, really? I'm going to be honest, as in all of these things, I said at the beginning, I said if I don't know, I can't speak for all Messianic Jews, and I suppose I'd have to say, in all honesty, there is probably no classical Messianic Jewish understanding of that theology either. What I can say is the position that we have moved ourselves to over the last 30 years, which is a position that we feel very comfortable with. And that is that, yes, we'd probably reject the classical Christian view of the Trinity if by that it means three separate beings. And often Christians do mean that. That's the kind of street level understanding often for most people. They may not really understand it, but that's often how it's presented. And one of the rabbis I was speaking to once about this, he was critiquing the Christian angle on this, and he was saying to me that Christians may say they believe in one God, but the reality is what they call a practical tritheism. They may say with their words they believe in one, but in reality, when you look at what they do and how they worship, practically, it's three. And that is fairly classical Jewish response to that situation. We are very clear in our own theology and website and elsewhere where we got some statements about this, that we do not believe in three gods. I absolutely reject that. That is not even a biblical position, I believe. Even from the very beginning of creation, we read that God, the Father, if you want to put a title on that, but let's say God the Father is creating the universe And at the same time, the Spirit of God is hovering on the waters. Now, there is no one in Jewish thinking, no Jewish person looks at that verse, which is in the Tanakh, it's part of Judaism. No one looks at that and says, two gods. No one. No one. We all understand when we read a verse like that God is still able to be our creator God, flinging the stars to the furthest ends of the cosmos, and at the same time, hovering on top of the waters. That's not a contradictory statement. And that's how we approach it with Yeshua too. No one from a Christian angle then comes along and says, well, look, God is love, and therefore love must be part of the Trinity. Well, I'm saying God is salvation. And yet no one is therefore saying he has to be a separate part of the Trinity. Yeah, do you see what I'm saying? His salvation and his love and who he is intimately bound up with his dynamic unity of who God is. You can't break that into separate bits, all one. And yet what we find in Yeshua is that aspect of his salvation is bodily manifested for us on earth at a certain time and period in history. Because let's not forget, Yeshua was existent before that time and is existent today still. So at that slice in time, there's a physical form comes in the same way that God took a physical form in the burning bush, in the same way that God took a physical form in the pillar of cloud and fire as it moved through the desert. To say that God has no form is wrong. I mean, I know, again, some of our greats have said this, Maimonides and Rashi and many others have repeated this, that God has no form. It's simply not true. The Torah does say he has a form, and at times does become visible in some way or other. So we know that God isn't afraid to take some physical form that we would recognize. And so the extension of that at that point is he takes a human form to show us the salvation he's offering to us as human beings. Okay? This is really critical that we understand that God is able to do this and reveal himself in this way to us.
So I don't want to reduce what you've said, but essentially Yeshua is God, or is a physical expression of salvation, and God is salvation.
Yeshua is God.
Yeah.
And God is one.
Yeah.
And God is salvation.
Yes.
And, we see revealed through that moment in history his salvation at work in the same way as we saw God parting the Reed Sea. We saw salvation at work before our eyes.
Yeah.
There's nothing new really in that way.
Yeah. And almost it's quite reductive, isn't it, to separate God into three parts as though that's it. That actually God is everything, but just will reveal himself in different ways at different times in history in order to fulfill his purpose.
Absolutely. In fact, the book of Isaiah and Revelation talks about the seven spirits of God, and yet I don't see any Christians walking around talking about the sevenfold nature of God. And yet the Torah says this. So it's wrong to get caught up with the numbers aspect, and it happens because really of Greek thinking, there's this sort of Hellenistic influence that is brought to bear upon the creation of Christianity under Constantine and beyond, and the Roman influence, which, as we know, was polytheistic background. And very quickly then, the saints were brought in and Mary was brought in, and all of that happens because of this spectrum of deities which Rome and Greece before it had. And it's that kind of Greek thinking, Hellenistic thinking, which was brought to bear upon this that really changed the view and influenced it. So when you get to the time of the Nicene Council, all of those influences are brought to bear. And my understanding is, actually, interestingly from that, my understanding as I have read it in places is that the Jewish believers were not allowed to be at the Nicene Council when that creed was written. And it looks possible that they were deliberately excluded because they wanted to fashion a creedal statement on the Trinity, which they didn't want any Jewish influence over at all. That is historically possible. It's probably difficult to prove. That nevertheless, that is what we understand. And that in its own way is very sad. Possibly yet another very early indication of Christian anti-Semitism that is going on there. So that's interesting in itself. But no, the classical Trinitarian position we wouldn't subscribe to in that way. We do subscribe to a biblical position. When people do ask me about it, I normally just hand them the scriptures and say that's what we believe. And that's very Jewish, because actually we don't reduce things to doctrines in Judaism, because how do you reduce God to a doctrine? You can't. Yeah. It's not possible. Yeah.
I mean, oh, goodness me. There's just so much. I do just want to quickly ask, just out of personal interest, in the original language in Genesis, when God is creating humans, it uses the plural. So it says, let us make humans in our own image.
That's correct.
What's your understanding of that verse?
My understanding is that is exactly true. The Hebrew is very peculiar in those early verses. Let us make, so you've got a plurality, but then the verbal forms are in the singular, and yet the pronoun forms are definitely in the plural. And the classical rabbinic answer to this has always been, well, it's the magisterial we. I'm not at all sure that that is in any way, shape or form true. I think it's just an attempt to remove an obvious incongruity really from this more monolithic, absolutist view within rabbinic Judaism of a pure one. Hebrew is more flexible than that. When a man and a woman get married, they are described as one flesh, and yet clearly they're still two. If you look at them, they're two people, and yet within the religious faith dimension, from God's perspective, they are one. God only sees one. So there's a plurality of unity in marriage. You have one congregation made up of multiple people and so on. You have one nation made up of a multitude of individuals. There's this kind of plurality of unity, which we see reflected all the way through culture and through nature. That is not surprising because we see that also reflected in the Godhead in that way too. And it comes out, as you rightly say, in the Hebrew and elsewhere. Let us make man in our image. And to begin with, of course, Adam was not masculine. He was created a human being. The traditional view is he was androgynous, and it's only later on that Chava is created out of him. But Adam was created one. Humanity is actually meant to be one. And if we think about it again, it's slightly tangential, but we think about it that the splitting up of humanity into nation states through languages at the Tower of Babel was a curse upon humanity. It actually wasn't God's original intention. We were meant to be one human kind, one human race living together without international borders, passports, or anything else, and certainly not without race, because again, race is not something biblical. Hence, racism is a sin. But race is not something biblical. We are all made in the image of God, regardless of our colour, eyes, you name it, hair colour, backgrounds, whatever. We're all made in the image of God and are equal before him. So that's again another concept to throw in there. But that's about the plurality of humanity, the oneness of humanity, who God is, and that dynamic plurality that is going on at all times.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and I think just reworks a lot of the kind of narrative of the Christian church over the last couple of thousand years, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm regularly throwing in the hand grenade.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just what is your relationship like with the Christian church?
It's better now. How blunt can I be on a podcast? I don't know. I mean, I don't want to offend anyone. I think when we first started 30 years ago in the UK, we were seen with a huge amount of suspicion. I think that's definitely fair to say. It was very awkward. While we were not literally cut off, as it were, we were certainly not included in a lot of things. We were seen with a great deal of suspicion. Today, that is much improved. I'm now today part of larger networks, a fellowship around that as well. I often now get invited to go and speak in churches, which didn't happen to begin with. There's a lot more awareness now of Messianic Judaism, of what it actually is, which is the Judaism that Yeshua taught. We haven't really talked a bit about that really yet, but we will do, I'm sure. But, there's more awareness of that aspect now and an openness to hear. So, yeah, on average, without the pandemic, I was getting an invitation every couple of months or so to go and speak in churches across the UK and abroad as well. I've got one outstanding in Spain, actually, to go to at some point to go and speak there. So there is now a much greater openness towards it, which is good. That's encouraging. On the Jewish side, I think, again, traditional Jewish side, there was huge suspicion to begin with. Most assumed that we were just Christians in disguise. It's taken a long time to begin to break down that misconception. When Jewish people come and worship in our synagogue, they very quickly realize it isn't a church and that we aren't Christian. I have heard it fed back to me occasionally now that we are beginning to get more comments along the lines of an understanding that we are a rebirth of sort of first century Nazarene faith. And bearing in mind that the reality behind that idea for most people is that the so-called Nazarene identity was still part of the Jewish identity at that time. It wasn't Christian. So in some ways, I suppose that is a step forward. It's a very, very slow process because the pain goes very deep in Jewish thinking. And the antagonism towards Yeshua is enormously deep, and it's not going to be cured in a generation. It's going to be a very slow process of bridge building and trust building. as time goes on. And I often say to Jewish people I know, we are not here to destroy you. Absolutely not. I love Judaism. I want Judaism to flourish. I'm revealing more about Judaism through Yeshua to Jewish community to enrich it and make it deeper and have a better understanding of what Judaism is. And actually, it was one of the professors of Judaism, Alan Siegel. He's a copious writer on the Jewish spectrum, and one of his more recent books looked at the so-called ancient Judaisms of the first century. And that in itself is a controversial title because most people think it's just rabbinic all the way back and nothing else was there. And of course, that isn't historically true, as we'll get onto in a moment. But he says in his introduction in there that actually we should be reading the thick New Testament as a thoroughly Jewish document of the first century because it teaches us what Judaism was like in the first century. Now, he's one of the few who is willing to go that far and stick his head over the parapet. I welcome that kind of statement from Jewish professors and academia because they're also doing a huge amount of research on the first century right now, as it also from the Christian angle too. And both sides are increasingly concluding that what we have been taught down the ages was wrong. And we need to radically review our understanding of how the first century developed. And that has implications. Time magazine said about 10 years ago, every year Time magazine rates like 1 to 10 ideas that will change the world that have come up in the previous year. And it's about 10 years ago that we entered that top 10. And one of the ideas that Time magazine listed was the Jewishness of Jesus. Yeah. And they said this idea, and that was 10 years ago, so this idea is literally going to change the world. Yeah. And I was thrilled when they ran it because they are absolutely correct. If you follow through the implications of that statement alone, it is absolutely mind-blowing and will, and as we are seeing in Messianic Judaism, change the world because it thoroughly challenges every conceived, handed-down idea about the origins of the faith and therefore what's happening today and what needs to change in the light of that research too. And as we know, with vested religious interests, they don't like to change.
No, absolutely not. I don't think as humans we like to change. I mean, let's see if we can unpack that in the time that we've got left, because I think this is an area I don't know very much about and you know much. And I know that time is short and you need to rush off. But what do we need to know about the first century that we don't currently know to help us understand more about it?
Okay, I'll try and summarize it if I can, because it's a vast, vast area that is now coming out. But effectively what we are seeing now is that really the first century Jewish practices, or as Alan Siegel, Jacob Neusner and others in that area, Daniel Biar and other scholars in this area are saying, is that we need to talk about the first century as a plurality of Judaisms, but Judaisms, not just a Judaism, because it clearly was not like that. And the origin of all this, you've got to go right back to Babylonian times, the 70 years we were there, during the times of Daniel, Jeremiah, and so on. We came out of that exile with various forms of Judaism that had helped us to survive the exile out of the land. And we brought it back in parallel with then the rebuilding of the temple. So you've got a renewed temple building. As we know, the second temple was begun under Ezra and Nehemiah. But parallel to that, the whole synagogue movement begins, which is an inheritance of Babylonian times. And these two power bases effectively begin to run through the times of the Maccabees and into the first century. So in the first century, we have then evidence on the grounds that the Pharisees, who were the inheritors of the sages and the scribes that again come back out of Babylon, they are beginning to develop this form of Judaism. You've got Messianic Judaism, which is there. You've got Sadduceic Judaism. You've got the fourth philosophy. You've got the Zealots. You've got a whole realm then of various forms. The Essenes, you name it, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect and so on. There's so many which are going on in the first century. And you have a real plurality. Really, the big question that's being asked in the first century is, what is the real Judaism? What is the correct form of Judaism? And this debate, which is then happening in the midst of Yeshua's own teaching and developing. So in the midst of all of this, you've got Yeshua saying, I am the way, and Haderech. And the Haderech concept, again in the first century, is one that is focusing on what is the correct way to live and walk out our Judaism. And every form of Judaism claimed to be the way. And it's not surprising, therefore, that we see evidence of that in the so-called New Testament. Yeshua says, I am the way. We have later on that I am a follower of the way, as it says in the book of Acts and elsewhere. The critical issue around all of this is that for Christian thinking, the idea is that Yeshua actually began a new religion from the get-go. That was his mission on earth, and it clearly wasn't. There was nothing Christian in the New Testament. Now, that is, again, a shocking, controversial statement. But if you read through it, Sermon on the Mount, it's Jewish. He's discussing Torah. Look at the debates that Yeshua had with the Plushim, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. He's debating Torah. He's debating Judaism all the way through. Yeshua, he was circumcised on the 8th day, that we know this, right? He's left debating in the temple with the scholars and so on. We know when he had his bar mitzvah, he's left behind at the age of 12. And so as we can see that all the way through his life, he is Jewish and nothing else. And this is your Time magazine thing again. The ripples and implications of this are huge.
Yeah.
If he only taught Judaism, then what are we going to do with that now? And it means that big beasts that we have today are going to have to start conceding ground. And we know that that is not easy. On the rabbinic side, what happens as we get towards the end of the first century, the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. The Sadduceic power base disappears at that point, and the Sadducees effectively disappear from history. The Essenes thought the temple was so corrupt anyway, they're out in the desert doing their own thing. They just disappear from history, as we know. The fourth philosophy disappear into Hellenism. Only two forms of Judaism survive the first century, Pharisaic Judaism and Messianic Judaism. Both of them are Jewish and nothing else. We have the brother of Yeshua, Yaakov. He's the head of the first din in Jerusalem. The letter that Yaakov wrote, we've got in the New Testament, the so-called letter of James, which is in itself an anti-Semitic title because it's not James. King James wanted it to be named after him. I mean, what?
Yes.
It's the letter of Jacob.
Yes.
That's what it is. It's a letter of Yaakov. And he wrote this. And it's a thoroughly Jewish letter, by the way. If you read it, it is dripping with Jewish thinking and Judaism all the way through and nothing else. It's a very powerful letter. Shaul's letters to the Jewish community spread around the Mediterranean basin, again discussing Jewish theology. His letter to the Jewish community in Rome, again, all the way through discussing theology.
Yeah. In
that letter of the olive tree theology that he brings in Romans 11, it's a Jewish theology about Israel, how those Gentiles not born Jewish are grafted into Israel and become Jews and become part of the house of Israel and the covenants of promise in that way. These are awesome letters, and they're Jewish letters all the way through. So we see that at the end of the first century, temple's gone, the Sadducees disappear. These two forms, Messianic Judaism and Pharisaic Judaism, proto-rabbinic Judaism, we could almost call it at that point, emerge out of the first century. They more or less are still living together uncomfortably by that point, but they're still worshipping together in the synagogues. They're still meeting together, eating together, and so on. There's no sense that there were necessarily separate places of worship, although there is some archaeological evidence possibly that on a Saturday evening, the end of Shabbat gathering was possibly extended for the Messianics because they remembered that Yeshua rose from the dead on a Saturday evening. Whoops, did I say it? Yes, it wasn't Sunday. It was a Saturday evening.
Yeah.
Another hand grenade. So there was evidence that maybe that they did meet together in that way to celebrate that event and to recognize that event. That is entirely possible.
Just for the purpose of our listeners, can you just simply differentiate between Pharisaic or Rabbinic Judaism and Messianic Judaism? So I'm presuming one is based on the law and one is based in the belief in Yeshua.
No, Messianic Jews believe in the Torah. We believe in the law, although we don't call it the law because the English word is just too wrong. Torah means teaching, guidance, instruction. That's a much better translation. It's not the law. The law is too harsh, and that's often been used against us as Jews, because of our so-called legalism and so on. Actually, it isn't the law in that sense at all. It's a complete misnomer. No, Messianic Jews absolutely support Torah. We are Torah observant, but we are Torah observant in the way that Yeshua taught us to be. So again, we scour through the Gospels and the letters to see how Yeshua lived the Torah by his lifestyle, his example, his teachings, what Rav Shaul, or Paul as you would call him, taught in the letters. Paul was taught by Gamaliel. He was taught under one of the best Pharisaic, proto-rabbinic sages and teachers of his day. He deeply knew that Jewish tradition. And when he accepts Yeshua into his life, he begins to reform it, but he's not chucking out the Torah. He's not throwing away Judaism. He's refashioning it now in the knowledge of what Yeshua taught and how he lived.
Yeah.
Because he didn't teach anything else either. Although, again, Paul gets blamed for this. But actually, he taught Judaism. That is literally all he did. It's only when we get up to the differentiation with Yeshua, yes. But that pretty much was it at that stage. When we get up to beyond Yavne, so Yavne and the rabbinic developments of the first seeds of rabbinic Judaism, which are beginning around your 80 CE into the early 2nd century. Around about that time, the divides begin to grow. It really peaks at Bar Kokhba in 135. And at that time, then, Rabbi Akiva rallies against the Romans. One more last push. We can overthrow them. We can claim the land back for ourselves. His biggest error, historical error at that point, was to claim that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And at that point, Messianic Jews said, we can't fight under that banner. He's not the Messiah. Yeshua is the Messiah. He drove a wedge down the middle of Israel. Akiva's gamble was that the Messianic Jews would crumble and actually rally to the cause. It was a massive gamble. And he wanted to break down Messianic Judaism and bring back into the fold. Because Messianic Jews were Torah observant, they loved God, they were identity-loving Jewish people, and he clearly wanted them on board for the numbers' sake. And he wanted to boost rabbinic Judaism, nascent rabbinic Judaism with the numbers. He seriously underplayed the reaction he was going to get. He just didn't realize what was going to happen. The love towards Yeshua was such that the Messianic Jews really had to make a choice, and they just said, no, we are not doing that. So you imagine the Jewish army is depleted at that point, the numbers go down, and the inevitable happens, we lose. And the Romans win at that point. We are scattered for 2,000 years across the Roman Empire. And today around the world, that happened as a result of that. And in many ways, that, from the traditional Jewish side, that there's often been viewed as a real betrayal of Israel at that point, and is held against us as Messianic Jews. But you can't sacrifice Messiah for someone who clearly is not. And Bar Kokhba was far from holy and righteous man. We have it from history. He certainly was not. He was nowhere near the biblical idea of who the Messiah was meant to be. And as we know, he failed miserably in his cause and did not solve Israel's problems. So was not seen as the Messiah. So that's ultimately really, from 135 onwards, you begin to see then a bigger falling apart between Messianic Jews and rabbinic Jews, not the church. That was not the case. For 400 years, Messianic Judaism continued. And we know this because of the way the church fathers write and their invectives against Messianic Jews still worshipping on Shabbat, still going to the high holy days. And, even when you get up to the 4th century and John Chrysostom, his diatribes and vitriol of hatred against the Jewish people simply doesn't make sense unless you understand that Messianic Jews were still involved with the synagogues.
Yes.
Why else would he bother? He's shouting to the wind. No one's listening. It's not a thing, right? You wouldn't bother about it. You wouldn't be writing a book today in the church about the dangers of worshipping in igloos. Everyone would go, who is? If that was on that level, why would you bother? You only do it if you've got a problem, right? And the problem right the way through to that stage was such that Jewish people were still worshipping in synagogues with their brothers and sisters in the Jewish faith, and many Gentiles still were. Because Judaism was seen, even amongst Gentile circles, in very high regard in ancient times like that, because of the rights that were given to women and the freedoms that were there were literally culture breaking of their time. Roman Empire was not like that. And it held a huge attraction to people right across the empire. Many, many, many thousands and thousands of Gentiles were pushing in and converting to Messianic Judaism at that time, as we know that's a historical fact.
Yeah.
So, it's only later on when it gets to the 4th century, really, that then Rome finally says enough already. We want a purely Gentile Christian church, which we can use in the Roman Empire for our political goals. And at that point, then a real break happens. But that's 400 years later on. And it certainly did not happen in the first or 2nd century. It just simply did not. All the evidence that we've got that is being discovered and is being researched right now shows there were vibrant Messianic Jewish communities for 400 years, all the way through until Rome eventually said enough.
Yeah, and I'm presuming this is Constantine, isn't it, that identified Christianity as a separate belief system or religion?
Absolutely. If you're looking for a point in history where there is a final cut, that is it. It's Constantine who says it's now a Roman religion, and it's not called Roman Catholicism for nothing. It does what it says on the tin.
Absolutely. And its centre still being in Rome as well.
And it's still is in Rome. Exactly. You know, it does exactly what it says in the tin. So nothing's changed. But for Jewish people, it's always been the question, where is the center, Jerusalem or Rome?
And how do Messianic Jews understand the role of Israel?
Very briefly, we could talk for hours on that again. You know, Israel is absolutely central to our faith. We love Israel. We don't believe Israel is perfect. You know, we don't believe Israel is perfect. Israel needs Messiah. And vast majority of Israel right now is secular and is non-practicing, although there is a large chunk of orthodoxy in there as well. No, Israel has many of the problems that most nations of the world have today in one form or other. And on top of all of that, of course, we have the Palestinian issue mixed into that too. It makes living in Israel very difficult. And some friends of mine who live in Israel always say it is such a challenge. It is so difficult. But we love Israel. We support Israel. Doesn't necessarily mean we support everything Israel does, but we will always love Israel and pray for Israel and be there for our land. We do believe in 1948 that God gave it back to us supernaturally, miraculously, after 2,000 years as a result of the covenant promises to Abraham and all the covenants through history. We knew at some point it would come back to us, and now it is. And that also for us points to the fact that the end of history is coming closer, and actually, yes, Yeshua as Mashiach, Messiah, is returning soon too. So we do believe that aspect that Yeshua said. The angel said there, as you saw him go, so he will return. And we do believe that Messiah will return at some point, but he'll be returning to Jerusalem, not Rome, not Canterbury, not Crown Heights in New York or anywhere else. He's returning to Jerusalem because he's the Jewish Messiah. And I suspect that is going to shock a lot of people when that happens because they wouldn't be expecting it in that way.
And do you believe that Jews are the chosen people?
Yes, absolutely. Again, have no problem with that at all. Jewish people are still the chosen people of God. The only thing I would say about that is that God is still choosing. When Gentiles convert to Messianic Judaism, God is still choosing people. That choice has not stopped. It's been going on always through history. You know, God was choosing Ruth the Moabitess. It's his choice to bring her in and add her into the Jewish fold, and continues to do so to this day. And we are very positive about conversion. We welcome it. We encourage people to do this. We don't go out and force people to do it, but if they are really feeling this is what they want to do to become fully part of the Jewish people, we will most definitely help them on that journey to do that. So we're very positive about that. We see as converts adding to our Judaism, not detracting from it. Each one brings something new, something different, something good into the fold of what Judaism should be. And if you look at Israel, it's a real melting pot. You've got Chinese Jews, Ethiopian Jews, African Jews, European Jews, every skin color, every culture, every background. I love it. I find it awesome. It's truly representative of all the world in Israel. It's a wonderful place to be. It really, really is. But all focused around worshipping the one true God and the Torah and Judaism. Beautiful. It's lovely. I hope to live there myself one day.
And I just think that's such a wonderful positive note to end on. But I just want to ask if there's any final message you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Final message. I suppose if we can understand that Judaism is something good, that it is positive, that it is the only revelation that God gave at Sinai. He didn't give a second religion. It's the only religion we read about in the Bible from cover to cover, from Genesis to the end of Revelation. It's the only religion, the only faith structure which is talked about. If we can remember that Yeshua is and always will be Jewish, that he's first and foremost the Jewish Messiah. He said, I've been sent to the lost house of the sheep of Israel. He never left Israel in his own ministry. You know, his primary focus was to see the salvation of our people, the children of Abraham. So if we can understand that and realize the implications of that and work that through, then we will be making a major difference in our time today to what the faith profile and structure should be and could be, and I believe will be.
Amazing. Rabbi Binyamin Sheldrake, thank you so much for being a guest on the RE podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it. But thank you so much for listening to us bore the life out of you.